What if the night you decided to end your life was the exact night God sent someone to save it? This is the story of a man who had every reason to give up, and one miraculous encounter that changed everything. Mark Thompson was a legend in the small town of Ridgemont, Ohio. For 20 years, he was the head football coach at Ridgemont High, and in a town where Friday night football was practically a religion, Mark was as close to a saint as anyone could get. He led the team to 3 state championships. He mentored hundreds of boys who went on to become good men. Parents trusted him with their sons, and the town trusted him with its pride. But 3 years ago, everything shattered in a single play. It was the 4th quarter of the regional semifinal. His star quarterback, a 17-year-old kid named Jason, took a brutal hit on a designed running play Mark had called. Jason did not get up. The ambulance came. The stadium went silent. And Mark Thompson's life as he knew it ended on that 50-yard line. Jason survived but suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. He could not walk without help. He could not finish a sentence without losing his thought. The boy who had a full scholarship waiting for him at Ohio State was now learning how to hold a fork again. The lawsuits came fast. Jason's parents led the charge, but other families joined. They said Mark had ignored concussion protocols. They said he had pushed players too hard. The school board fired him within a month. His coaching license was revoked. His wife, Amy, who had stood beside him through 20 years of late practices and early mornings, filed for divorce 6 months later. She said she did not recognize him anymore. She was right. He did not recognize himself. His daughter, Lily, stopped returning his calls. His friends in town crossed the street when they saw him coming. The house that once smelled like Sunday pot roast and laundry detergent now smelled like whiskey and regret. The trophies on the mantel gathered dust. The game films in the basement gathered mold, and Mark gathered darkness around himself like a blanket. On a Friday night in October, exactly 3 years after Jason's injury, Mark sat at his kitchen table during the worst thunderstorm of the season. Lightning cracked the sky outside and rain pounded the roof like fists. In front of him was a half-empty bottle, a pen, and a piece of paper. He had been writing for an hour. His final letter. To anyone who reads this, it began, "Everything was my fault. I destroyed a boy's life. I destroyed my family. I destroyed myself. I cannot carry this anymore." He signed his name at the bottom and set down the pen. And that is when he heard the knock at the door. What would you do if a total stranger walked into your house at midnight and spoke the one name that could break you completely open? Mark stared at the front door. Nobody came to his house anymore. Not the neighbors, not old friends, not even the mailman lingered. He thought about ignoring it. He thought about a lot of things in that moment. But the knock came again, steady and patient, as if whoever was out there had all the time in the world and no intention of leaving. He opened the door. Standing on his porch in the pouring rain was an old man. He looked to be in his early 70s with a lean, weathered face and silver hair that was soaked flat against his head. He wore a simple dark coat that was completely drenched, and his shoes were muddy from walking. But his eyes were what stopped Mark cold. They were calm and clear and impossibly kind. The eyes of someone who had already walked through fire and come out the other side, carrying peace instead of ashes. "I'm sorry to bother you this late," the old man said. "My car broke down about a mile up the road. Could I use your phone to call for a tow?" Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to close the door and go back to his letter. But something about this man's presence made that impossible. He stepped aside and let him in. The old man entered slowly and looked around the kitchen. His eyes moved across the empty bottles, the scattered newspaper clippings about the lawsuit, the divorce papers on the counter, and the letter sitting on the table. He did not stare. He did not judge. He simply took it all in, the way a doctor takes in symptoms before making a diagnosis. "Phone's on the wall," Mark said flatly. The old man nodded, but did not move toward it. Instead, he turned to Mark and said very quietly, "Mark, Jason wants you to know something." The room tilted. Mark grabbed the edge of the counter to steady himself. He had not told this man his name. He had not mentioned Jason. There was nothing on the door or the porch or anywhere visible that could have given this stranger those two pieces of information. "How do you know that name?" Mark whispered. "Who are you?" "My name is Eli," the old man said. "I am Jason's grandfather, and I did not come here because my car broke down. I came because my grandson asked me to find you before it was too late." Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone. "Jason has been trying to reach you for months, Mark. You changed your number. You moved. You disappeared. But that boy never stopped looking for you. He has something he needs you to hear." Eli opened a video on the phone and held it out. Mark's hands were shaking so badly he could barely take it. On the screen was Jason. Have you ever heard words so powerful they pulled you back from the edge of an abyss you were about to fall into? Mark held the phone and watched the video through eyes blurred with tears. Jason was standing, not in a wheelchair, not supported by rails or therapists, standing on his own 2 feet in what looked like a rehabilitation center gymnasium. He was thinner than Mark remembered, and there was a scar visible near his left temple, but he was standing, and he was looking directly into the camera with the same fierce determination he used to have in the huddle before a big play. "Coach Thompson," Jason said, "I know you're out there somewhere, blaming yourself for what happened to me. I know because I know you. You taught me everything about never giving up, and I watched you give up on yourself. Coach, I'm walking again. The doctor said it might never happen, but it happened. And you know what got me through the worst days? It was your voice in my head saying the same thing you said before every single game. Champions are not made when they get knocked down. Champions are made when they get back up. Coach, I got back up. Now it is your turn." The video ended. Mark's legs gave out. He sank to the kitchen floor, still clutching the phone, and a sound came out of him that he did not know he was capable of making. It was not crying. It was something deeper and more ancient than crying. It was the sound of 3 years of guilt and shame and self-destruction breaking apart all at once like ice cracking on a frozen river in spring. Eli knelt beside him slowly and placed a hand on his shoulder. The old man's grip was surprisingly strong and warm. They stayed like that for a long time. The storm howled outside, but inside that kitchen, something was shifting. "Mark," Eli said gently, "God did not send me here tonight to watch you finish that letter. He sent me here to tell you he has a different plan. That letter you wrote is full of lies. You are not beyond repair. You are not beyond forgiveness. And you are not beyond purpose. The enemy wants you to believe your story ends tonight. But God is telling you your story is just getting started." Mark looked at the letter on the table. The ink was smeared from his tears. The words he had written an hour ago already felt like they belonged to a different person. He reached up and crumpled the paper slowly in his fist. Then he let it fall to the floor. Psalm 34, verse 18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Mark had been crushed, completely and thoroughly crushed. But in that moment, on his kitchen floor, with a stranger's hand on his shoulder and a boy's voice echoing in his ears, he felt for the first time in 3 years that maybe, just maybe, God had not given up on him after all. What happens when a broken man finds the courage to walk through a door he swore he would never open again? Eli stayed until the storm passed. They talked through the night. Mark told him everything: the guilt, the drinking, the divorce, the silence from his daughter. Eli listened without interruption and without judgment. When the first gray light of dawn appeared through the kitchen window, Eli stood up and said, "There is a church on Riverside Drive called Grace Community. The pastor there is a friend of mine. He runs a mentoring program for at-risk teenagers, boys who need someone to believe in them the way you used to believe in your players. He has been looking for the right person to lead it. Mark shook his head immediately. I am the last person who should be around kids. I ruined a kid's life. Eli looked at him steadily. You made a mistake, Mark. A terrible one. But a mistake does not define you unless you let it. Jason did not send me here to find a man who is finished. He sent me to find a man who still had something to give. It took Mark 2 weeks to work up the nerve to visit the church. He drove past it 3 times before finally pulling into the parking lot. Pastor James met him at the door with a handshake and a cup of coffee, and the easy warmth of a man who had seen broken people walk through that door 1,000 times. The youth center was in the gymnasium behind the sanctuary. It was not fancy. Folding chairs, a worn basketball court, a whiteboard, and about 15 teenagers who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Mark stood at the edge of the room, feeling completely out of place. Then a 16-year-old kid with sharp eyes and a defensive posture walked up to him. You the new guy? The kid asked. I guess so, Mark said. You any good? Mark almost smiled. It was the first time in years someone had asked him a question that did not involve lawyers or blame. I used to be, he said honestly. I am trying to figure out if I still am. The kid's name was Kevin. He was raised by a single mother after his father walked out. He was smart and athletic, but angry at a world that had let him down at every turn. He reminded Mark so much of the boys he used to coach that it physically hurt. Over the next few weeks, Mark showed up every Tuesday and Thursday. He did not try to be a hero. He just showed up. He listened. He threw the football with kids who had never had a man teach them how to hold one. He sat with Kevin on the bleachers and talked about what it means to get knocked down and what it takes to get back up. And slowly, so slowly he almost did not notice it happening, the ice around his heart began to thaw. What happens when the person you need to forgive the most turns out to be standing right in front of you? It was a Thursday evening in November, and Mark was cleaning up the gym after the youth session when a woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her 40s with tired eyes and her arms crossed tightly against her chest as if she were holding herself together. Coach Thompson, she said. Mark looked up and the blood drained from his face. He knew her. Her name was Linda. 3 years ago, she had stood in a courtroom and called him a monster. She had led the group of parents who demanded his termination. She had looked him in the eye during the hearing and said she wished he would disappear from this town forever. And now she was standing in the doorway of the church gymnasium where her son Kevin had been meeting with Mark every week for the past 2 months. Mark had never made the connection. Kevin's last name was different from his mother's. He had never asked. And now the two of them stood 10 feet apart with 3 years of pain and anger and grief hanging in the air between them. I know who you are, Mark said quietly. And I know who you are, Linda replied. Her voice cracked. Kevin talks about you every night at dinner. He says you are the only adult who has ever really listened to him. He says you taught him that making mistakes does not make you worthless. She paused and pressed her hand against her mouth. I came here to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. What happened to Jason was terrible, but what I did to you was terrible too. I was so angry and so scared, and I needed someone to blame. I turned you into a villain because it was easier than facing the fact that sometimes awful things happen and nobody is entirely at fault. Mark's eyes filled with tears. He had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, but he never imagined it would happen here, in a church gym, brought about by the very boy whose life was being changed by the very program that was changing his own. Linda, he said, I replay that moment every single day. I call that play. I will carry that for the rest of my life. But I am learning that carrying it does not have to mean being crushed by it. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Linda walked forward and extended her hand. Mark took it, and in that handshake, quiet and trembling and imperfect, 3 years of bitterness began to dissolve. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32 says, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Forgiveness is never easy. It is not a feeling. It is a decision. And on that November evening in a small church gym, two people who had every reason to remain enemies made the hardest and holiest decision of their lives. There are moments so sacred that everyone in the room knows they are standing on holy ground. The church youth program had grown from 15 kids to over 40 in just a few months, and Pastor James decided to hold a showcase evening where the teenagers could share what they had learned. Parents were invited. The community was welcome. Mark spent weeks preparing the kids for presentations and demonstrations. He was nervous in a way he had not been since his first game as a head coach. The gymnasium was packed that Friday evening. Folding chairs filled every inch of floor space, and people stood along the walls. Mark was helping Kevin rehearse his speech in the back hallway when he heard the front door open and a murmur ripple through the crowd. He looked up, and his heart stopped. Walking through the gymnasium door was Jason, not in a wheelchair, not with a walker, walking slowly and deliberately, with the careful steps of someone who had fought for every single one, but walking on his own. The room went completely silent. Jason scanned the crowd until his eyes found Mark, and then he smiled. It was the same smile Mark had seen 1,000 times on the sideline. The smile that said, "Coach, I am ready." Jason walked across that gymnasium floor, and every step echoed like a heartbeat. Mark could not move. His feet were anchored to the ground, and his vision was blurred with tears that he could not stop and did not try to. Jason reached him and, without a word, wrapped his arms around his former coach. "I told you I would walk again, Coach," Jason whispered. "And I told Grandpa Eli to find you because I was not going to let you quit. Not you. Not the man who taught me to never stay down." Mark held on to that young man and sobbed. 3 years of guilt. 3 years of nightmares. 3 years of believing he had destroyed this boy's life. And here was Jason, standing on his own 2 feet, holding him up. The entire gymnasium erupted. People were crying and clapping, and some were on their knees in prayer. Kevin stood in the back hallway, watching with tears streaming down his face. Linda had her hands over her mouth. Pastor James stood at the podium, unable to speak. It was Kevin who finally broke the silence. He walked to the microphone and said, "Coach Thompson taught me that getting knocked down is not the end of your story." Tonight I can see he was right. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." Mark had not believed that verse for 3 years. But standing in that gymnasium with Jason's arms around him, and 40 kids who looked up to him, and a room full of people witnessing the impossible, he believed it now. What happens when a man who lost everything discovers that God was building something bigger from the broken pieces? All along? The showcase evening changed everything for Ridgemont. The local newspaper ran the story. Then the regional stations picked it up. Within a week, the video of Jason walking into that gymnasium and embracing his former coach had been viewed over 2 million times online. Messages poured in from across the country. Former players Mark had coached decades ago reached out to say he had changed their lives. Parents who had condemned him publicly wrote private letters of apology. Churches in neighboring towns asked how they could start similar youth programs. But the thing that mattered most to Mark happened quietly on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the showcase. He was sitting in the 3rd pew at Grace Community Church when someone slid into the seat beside him. He turned and saw his daughter, Lily. She was 24 now, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She had not spoken to him in over 2 years. She did not say anything at first. She just sat beside him and opened a hymnal. Halfway through the first song, she reached over and took his hand. Mark could not sing after that. He just held his daughter's hand and let the tears fall, and let the music wash over both of them like rain on dry ground. After the service, Lily told him she had seen the video. She told him she was sorry for shutting him out. She told him she had been angry not because she thought he was a bad coach, but because she thought he had chosen football over family her whole life. And when everything fell apart, he proved her right by pushing everyone away instead of letting them help. Mark listened and nodded because she was right. He had been so consumed by guilt over Jason that he had abandoned the people who needed him most. "I cannot get those years back, Lily," he said, "but I am here now, and I am not going anywhere again." The youth program officially became the Ridgemont Youth Athletic Ministry. Jason signed on as assistant director, bringing his story of resilience to every kid who walked through the door. Kevin became the first team captain and the first in his family to talk seriously about college. Linda volunteered in the kitchen every Thursday, and her relationship with Mark became an unlikely testament to the power of forgiveness. And Mark finally understood what Eli had told him that stormy night. God does not waste pain. He recycles it. He takes the worst chapter of your life and turns it into the opening line of someone else's rescue story. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 says God comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble. Mark's deepest wound had become his greatest ministry. What if the person who saved your life was never really a person at all? A year had passed since the night Eli knocked on Mark's door. Mark had tried several times to find him. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted to introduce him to the kids at the program. He wanted Eli to see what that one midnight visit had grown into. He drove to the address Eli had mentioned that night, a small house on the east side of town near the old railroad track. But when he got there, a young couple answered the door. They had lived there for 6 years. They had never heard of anyone named Eli. Mark went to Jason's family next. He asked about Jason's grandfather. Jason's mother looked confused. "Mark, both of Jason's grandfathers passed away before he was born. He never had a grandfather named Eli." Mark sat in his truck outside Jason's house for a long time. He was not confused. He was not frightened. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest that he could only describe as certainty. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2 says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Mark smiled and looked up through the windshield at the clear blue sky. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for sending him, for sending all of it." He started the engine and drove across town to the high school. It was Friday afternoon, and the visiting team's coach was sitting alone on the bleachers, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. Mark had heard the story through the coaching network. The man's team had just lost their 10th straight game. Parents were calling for his firing. His marriage was under strain. He was thinking about quitting the profession entirely. Mark climbed the bleachers and sat down beside him. They watched the empty field together in silence for a moment. Then Mark said, "Tough season?" The coach laughed bitterly. "You could say that." "Can I tell you something?" Mark said. 3 years ago, I was sitting alone in my kitchen writing a goodbye letter to the world. I had lost everything. My career, my family, my faith, all of it. I was done. And then someone knocked on my door. A stranger. And that stranger told me something I'm going to tell you right now. God has not given up on you. Your worst chapter is not your last chapter. And the pain you are carrying right now is going to become the very thing that helps someone else survive theirs. The coach looked at him, and for the first time all season, his eyes showed something other than defeat. Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card with the church address and his phone number written on it. "Come by Tuesday night. There are some kids I want you to meet. And there is a God I want you to get to know again." He stood up, patted the man on the shoulder, and walked back down the bleachers. The sun was setting behind the goalposts, and the shadow of the crossbar stretched across the field in the shape of a cross. Mark walked through it and kept going. A man who had been saved by a knock at midnight now carrying that same knock to every closed door he could find. Because that is what grace does. It does not stop with you. It moves through you and reaches the next person, and the next, and the next, an unbroken chain, stretching from one broken heart to another, held together not by human strength, but by the hands of a God who never stops knocking. Freely you have received. Freely give.